My name is Randy Fielding, and I'm the co-founder and chairman of Fielding Nair International. We're architects, and we focus on educational facilities from kindergarten through university.
What career would you like?
I wanted to be an architect.
Yeah?
I always loved design, I loved art. And in high school, I was an art major. Drafting courses didn't interest me so much because the part of design and architecture and art that interested me was a little more on the creative than the technical end. In the same line, I wasn't so interested in math, and a lot of people advised me that if you want to be an architect, you better be really good at math. That worried me a little bit. I was okay at it, but it wasn't that fun for me. So I thought, well, I'll focus on art, which I love, and deal with the math later.
Architecture there?
I did. I went to Carnegie Mellon University, and then that's in Pittsburgh, and Washington University in St. Louis, and then University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and then University of Illinois in Chicago. And I majored in architecture. I did. I got a Master of Architecture finally at University of Illinois, where I was the founding editor of the Architecture School Journal as well.
Next step?
Well, since I was at 3 universities, between the third, University of Minnesota, and the fourth, I worked at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. So one of the reasons I was at so many universities, I was in graduate school at University of Minnesota, but I met a professor who was a visiting professor from Skidmore, Owings & Merrill in Chicago. And that was then the largest architectural firm in the world, and they were focusing on educational facilities, which interested me. And I had taken a break between Washington U and University of Minnesota to be an artist for a while. In Minneapolis, right near here, just 5 blocks away, I had a loft, and I was a painter and a sculptor, and I even did performance art. My work at University of Minnesota was very focused on art, it was, as opposed to the technical aspects. So the visiting professor from Chicago had a modern art collection, and he was kind of interested in that. So what happened is the first job opportunity for me, which is perfect, my perfect job, came about because I was actually not doing what everyone else was doing. I was the least technical drafter, and in fact my professors at University of Minnesota would say, "That's great, you're so creative, but would you please follow the program?" So, and this was my entire career and school from kindergarten on. I was never quite doing exactly what I was asked to. This happened to work for me because that partner from Chicago was an iconoclast himself. I got a job to be on a team designing a university in Algeria when I was in my early 20s, my dream job. And I did that for a little while, and then finished my graduate work in University of Illinois. Constantly, my firm works in 44 countries. Well, I worked there for a couple of years, and then I started to moonlight, and I started to do some work for some residential clients at night and on weekends. And after about a year of that, I launched my own practice. Well, it varies very much depending on the architect. Our firm is probably unique. We created a different category of architects, I think, in that we are focused completely on architecture and education. And so it's as much about change and change management as it is about design. And also, since I'm focused on the creative end and not the technical end, I typically don't act as the architect of record. So architects are licensed, and I'm licensed in 8 different states and provinces in Canada. In some cases, I will stamp those drawings and take legal responsibility for all the engineering, hiring all the engineers. But 95% of the time, what we do is we do the creative work. We help people with visioning, building a common agenda, help them align their curriculum and pedagogy with spatial patterns. Then we design the building in terms of the floor plans, what it looks like on the outside, we pick the colors, the furnishings, but we don't actually do the construction administration or hire all the engineers for all those technical details. So I'm unusual in that. So in the last week, for example, I was with a community in Ontario, Canada, and our focus was we were doing space-based curriculum mapping. We were sharing a conceptual design with parents and teachers and students and superintendents, and we're explaining to them how our earlier meeting a few months ago, where we did discovery work and finding out what was important to them in their community. For example, that happened to be in a poor community, so they had public housing projects. And so part of the message there was, what do you want for your kids, and who do you want to be? And my role, I felt the most important thing was to inspire them and say your kids can do anything in the world. It doesn't matter that you've never graduated from high school. This is a world where kids can actually, they can take a MOOC and they can get a college degree now like they never could before, regardless of your economic status. And that this building and this school can be one of the best in the world, even though right now you're in the poorest in the whole region in Canada. So that led to, principles about learning, and then what kind of learning spaces are going to best help different kinds of kids. Healthcare is very big.
Hospitals?
Yes, medical facilities, residential, prisons. A lot of architects are interested in design, not a specific category, so they'll do everything. But you have a better opportunity for success to specialize. And so early on, I thought I'm going to have my own. I launched my own firm at 29 and supported a family, so I needed to make money. And I thought if I want to specialize, I had heard that the best fields for making money were prison work, hospital work, or schools. They're institutional, so larger budgets. And I thought I absolutely don't want to be around people, spend all my time around people who are in prison. That's a painful thing. I also didn't want to spend all my time around people who are sick and being healed. Not to say that, there's a wonderful mission, of course, in designing spaces to make people healthier, but I thought when people learn, there's something so exciting, our very nature, that what it means to be human is to learn, and there's a joy there that I thought would inspire me. And also, from kindergarten on, I didn't think school met my needs. So I thought that pedagogy and curriculum, they didn't really have it right. And through a lifetime of research found that, in fact, for a lot of people, school is way too rigid and prescriptive. And so I've had a mission my whole life to reinvent learning and reinvent learning spaces. So that's why I focused on education. Yeah. So most schools follow a 150-year-old model. It goes back to, we went from the one-room schoolhouse, which responded to an agrarian economy where people worked on the farms and they needed to come together when they weren't working on the farms. Not during the summer, with no school during the summer, and work together to learn reading and writing. From there, as the economies industrialized, we needed a lot more students. We needed to manage a lot more students than you would in, say, a one-room schoolhouse. In cities, you had lots and lots of students to manage. So as the industrial age came along, we found that the easiest way to educate a lot of students was in what I call the cells and bells model. A lot of classrooms that are exactly the same size with one manager or teacher at the front of the room with about 25 to 40 students all lined up taking orders. It's very military hierarchical order. Anyway, that approach was great for training people to work in factories. You learned how to obey orders. You learned how to, put one thing. If you're working in a factory, you want to be able to put a bolt in a hole and do the next one. It was never been the best system of education for people who are going to think creatively. And in our age, where it's so important, employers are working for people who can collaborate, who can think creatively, who can also work in an interdisciplinary way. so they can work in different fields. So if you look at, for example, the best capitalized company in the world right now, Apple, the reason why Apple is successful is not because they're an engineering company or they're a design company or a media company. It's the intersection of all three of those things. So there was a synthetic kind of intelligence that puts those things together. And most of the really successful companies are looking for that kind of creative, interdisciplinary, collaborative, active sort of thinking, which doesn't lend itself to that in a bells and cells model. So our schools respond to the way a really good learning day will have a cycle of several types of learning. First, there may be a collaborative kind of learning. You may be talking together. It could be in front of the school. It could be at a coffee shop. And that's interacting with others, interacting with the world. It's being more outward focused, it's seeing what's going on. And then you also need a part of the time which is more individual, focused, reflective. You really don't create or build or learn a lot until you absorb information and you make it your own. And that's very individual. Schools have almost no individual spaces. Is there any personal space in school for you guys? Of course not. And then the other kind of thing that's very important in a learning cycle, we've got collaborative individuals, you need an active time. An ideal day, you go out then after you collaborated and you reflected and work individually. It might be at a computer, it might be writing, it could be playing the violin. Also doing something very active, usually out of your chair, because we're not just brains, you know, our minds and our hearts and our bodies are connected. So that might be a space where you're doing robotics or you're building something. It could be in a lab work. It could also be physical education. So schools have that, but in a very limited way. They tend to, traditional schools, bells and cells, focus most of the space on a modified collaborative model, very linear lecture. They're almost all lecture spaces. Then they have a gym and they have a cafeteria. But the schools we design, there's a much more equal balance of collaborative, individual, and active spaces, and lots of variety. Instead of just having a lot of same-sized classrooms and corridors being essentially wasted space where kids go from one place to another, those spaces between the learning areas are just as important for people to engage and interact in informal learning. We learn just as much in informal ways as we do in formal ways, and this has been proven 1,000 times. It's the way human beings evolve, that our brains, our survival evolved so we could think on our feet. We could respond to things. So we don't necessarily just sit here, learn, then go here, sit here, and learn. We're just as likely to learn in the hallway in between spaces. And so we don't have hallways in our buildings, but we have lots of different kinds of varied spaces. So the whole building is a space for learning. I love the creative process, and part of the creative process is actually not just making something, but what I call the discovery process. So it's as much about observation and interaction and connection as it is about doing something. A good creative process is completely tied to understanding what the need is out there in the world. And I would say that as advice to students. You've probably heard the advice, follow your bliss. I would agree with that, that's great. But at the same time, it's equally important to understand what is the need out there in the world. Because there are a lot of people who say, I want to do this, but it's hard to be successful unless you can really see and observe what does the world need. And if you can align a need with what you love to do, that's fantastic. And so I love doing that. I see everywhere around the world lots of schools that are performing poorly, lots of students who don't love what they're doing, who aren't engaged, who what they really like is getting out of school, what they really like is sports, what they really like is dance or art or everything but actually being in school. And so I see there's this tremendous need, and I think I understand how to respond to that need, and I could do that. My tool, more than teaching, although we have educators in our staff, I like the design, I like seeing physical, concrete things. Color really excites me, so engaging. But that's my tool to respond to a particular need, which is really the world. Education is, there's a huge need in the world. So. Well, two kinds. One for being an architect, and just in advice in general is that I got very little good advice throughout my career from guidance counselors or from professors who, most of my professors treated me in architecture like I was working for them. and they were trying to tell me what to do, which was a projection of what they thought was the right thing to do. And I don't think that's good teaching, and I don't think that's good advice for people. I'm successful, we're a global leader in design, have all the work we want, financially successful, and I think I got there by doing my own thinking. You have to be, you have to take what you're hearing and advice with a grain of salt. So I didn't follow the programs, the curriculums, the advice, and it didn't mean I didn't work hard or observe what the needs are out there or do well. But I think one of the worst, the typical approach in education, there's this traditional, it's a myth, it's some people call it the coverage model, and that is learn this stuff even though you don't want to know it now because you're going to need it later. Learn this stuff even though you're not interested now because you need it later. And it might be, you might enjoy calculus, but someone else is forced to take calculus when they're 16 or 18 when they're not interested. Hey, it was way better for me to say, I'll take calculus when I need to. So when I was studying structural design, which was more interesting, I learned calculus, no problem. And if you look at the educational theory, what they'll find, it's a very stupid linear approach to say, do something when you don't want to be doing it. Try and do what interests you, and work it out that you study the things that you need to when you need to. So the typical order you see in high school, undergraduate school, it often doesn't make sense. It makes more sense to study the things you really enjoy, then you'll do better at them. And find a way to create your own programs when you can, and study the things you're interested when you want to, when you need to, and it works better.